By the time Xiao Zhan became one of the most recognizable faces in Chinese entertainment, he no longer looked like an ordinary celebrity. He looked like a phenomenon. After breaking out through the Untamed in 2019, he surged from rising actor-singer to full-blown traffic star, and by 2025, he was still carrying major projects while also releasing new music, including the album WM. From the outside, everything about him suggested unstoppable momentum, beauty, fandom, commercial power, and the kind of fame that seems too big to reverse. But Xiao Zhan's story turned dark almost as quickly as it became huge. In early 2020, the 227 incident transformed his fame into a target. After a fan fiction controversy escalated into mass reporting tied to AO3, the backlash spread across platforms, and Xiao Zhan's name became attached to a wave of anger far bigger than any normal celebrity scandal. On March 1, 2020, Xiao Zhan's studio issued a public apology as the fallout grew. What made it so brutal was that this was not a simple fall caused by one reckless act on camera. It was a modern internet storm. Fandom, anti-fandom, platform culture, and public punishment all collapsing onto one face. That is where this story begins, not with triumph and not with innocence, but with a question. How did a star who was rising too fast to ignore suddenly become the perfect target for a digital mob? Because Xiao Zhan did not just become famous, he became so visible that when the storm came, there was nowhere for him to hide. Before Xiao Zhan became one of the most intensely watched stars in Chinese entertainment, he lived a life that looked almost too ordinary for the scale of fame that would later find him. He was born in Chongqing in 1991, studied at the Modern International Art Design Academy at Chongqing Technology and Business University, and developed artistic interests long before the industry knew his name. He learned painting and violin as a child, and by the time he reached university, he was active in school arts groups and choral activities. What makes this beginning so important is that it was not built inside the usual machinery of child stardom. Xiao Zhan was not trained from childhood to survive fandom, cameras, and public obsession. He grew up with a more conventional path in front of him: design, creative work, and a life that could easily have remained outside entertainment altogether. That is the first hidden softness in his story. Before the fame became enormous, he still belonged to the world of ordinary ambitions. That is why his entry into show business feels so different from many stars around him. In 2015, after a teacher recommended him, Xiao Zhan joined the talent survival program X-Fire, even though he had already graduated and was older than the kind of fresh-faced trainee the public usually expects from idol systems. He did not arrive as someone raised for the spotlight. He arrived as someone stepping into it comparatively late, with no guarantee that the transition would work. In 2016, he debuted as the main vocalist of X9, and around the same time he began acting in projects like Superstar Academy. But that early stage of his career did not yet feel like the beginning of a giant destiny. It felt uncertain, experimental, and fragile. The life of a man trying to learn an entirely new system in public while already carrying the quiet pressure of having started later than many of his peers. That detail matters emotionally because it changes the way his rise feels. Xiao Zhan did not come from a childhood prepared for fame. He had to become legible to the entertainment industry fast, while also figuring out whether he belonged there at all. And maybe that is why the years before his breakout matter so much. Between 2016 and 2018, he kept moving through supporting roles, cameos, and smaller projects, including Oh My Emperor, where he began earning more recognition as a performer. But none of this yet made him the Xiao Zhan the world now recognizes. He was still in the process of being assembled, not just as an actor or singer, but as a public figure. The man who would later become a traffic star with a fandom strong enough to shake the internet was, at this stage, still someone learning how to carry visibility. That is the emotional truth of Xiao Zhan before the Untamed. He entered the industry not as a born idol, but as someone who came late, adapted quickly, and quietly climbed through a system that does not usually wait for late arrivals to catch up. Before the storm, before the worship, before 227 turned his name into a battlefield, Xiao Zhan was simply a man trying to make the spotlight feel like somewhere he could stand. Xiao Zhan's rise did not feel inevitable until suddenly it felt too big to stop. Before 2019, he was still a latecomer trying to build momentum inside an industry that rarely waits for people who arrive after the usual trainee window. He had debuted with X9 in 2016 as the group's main vocalist and was gradually picking up acting work, but none of that yet suggested the scale of what was about to happen. Then the Untamed arrived, and everything changed at once. The drama did not just make him more visible, it detonated his name across fandom culture, streaming culture, social media, and international discussion all at the same time. PR Newswire reported in July 2019 that the series had topped domestic Chinese web drama rankings and even became the top trending topic on Twitter while drawing growing overseas attention. Global Times later reported that the show's popularity had spread strongly into markets like Thailand and South Korea, with huge overseas fan enthusiasm around cast events. This is the moment Xiao Zhan stopped feeling like a promising actor-singer and started feeling like a phenomenon the internet itself had decided to carry. And because he played Wei Wuxian, a role full of beauty, pain, chaos, defiance, and emotional magnetism, the reaction was not mild admiration. It was attachment. The audience did not just watch Xiao Zhan rise, it locked onto him. What made that breakthrough so powerful was that it changed not only his fame, but the meaning of his image. Before the Untamed, Xiao Zhan still looked like someone assembling a career. After it, he looked like a true traffic star, a celebrity whose name could move fandom energy, commercial attention, and public conversation at a scale far beyond normal popularity. That kind of fame is different from ordinary success because it does not stay inside the work. It spills outward into every measurable thing: searches, brand power, fan activity, online discourse, media obsession. And Xiao Zhan did not vanish after the hit, which is what makes this part of the story more important. He carried the momentum into projects like Joy of Life in 2019 and later high-profile dramas that kept his face and name fixed in the public imagination. The first anniversary of The Untamed alone generated enormous online activity. Global Times reported that the related Sina Weibo hashtag had passed 1.4 billion views in 2020, while international users were also celebrating the show online. That matters because it shows that Xiao Zhan's rise was not a one-week craze. It became a fandom ecosystem. The role had turned him into more than a handsome actor with a hit. It had turned him into a center of emotional and digital gravity. And once that happens to a star, life becomes much more dangerous, because traffic fame does not only reward, it amplifies. That is why this chapter of Xiao Zhan's life feels both triumphant and ominous at the same time. On the surface, he had achieved the dream: national recognition, exploding fan devotion, global attention, and the kind of beauty the camera seemed born to magnify. But underneath that success, a quieter danger was already forming. The faster a star rises through fandom culture, the less control he really has over the emotional machinery surrounding him. Xiao Zhan had become too visible, too adored, too symbolically important to his supporters, and too irritatingly unavoidable to his detractors. In other words, the Untamed did not simply make him powerful, it made him vulnerable in a new way. The same internet that could lift him into obsession could also turn that obsession into punishment. And that is what makes this Rise chapter so important to the whole script. Xiao Zhan did not just become famous. He became the kind of famous that no longer belongs only to the artist. It belongs to fandom, to discourse, to projection, to desire, to resentment. He had finally reached the height he had entered the industry late to chase, but by reaching it so quickly and so completely, he also stepped into the exact kind of spotlight that can turn a star into a battlefield. The darkest turn in Xiao Zhan's story came not from a failed project, a reckless scandal, or one disastrous interview. It came from the internet, and from the terrifying speed with which fame can become a weapon once it stops belonging only to the person at the center of it. In early 2020, a fanfiction controversy tied to the Untamed fandom spiraled into what became known as the 227 incident. A work called Falling circulated on AO3 and other platforms, reimagining Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo in ways that some of Xiao Zhan's fans considered insulting and explicit. Groups of fans then began reporting the work and related content. After that escalation, AO3 was blocked in mainland China, and a huge number of users blamed Xiao Zhan's fandom for triggering the loss of access to one of the internet's most important fan fiction archives. That is where the emotional shape of the story changed, because at that moment, Xiao Zhan stopped being just a star in the middle of a boom. He became the face attached to a cultural loss that made thousands of people furious. He did not need to be the direct architect of the entire chain of events for the backlash to land on him anyway. In the logic of internet outrage, visibility is enough, and Xiao Zhan by then was visible enough to absorb every layer of anger at once. What followed was not ordinary criticism, it was mass punishment. As the backlash spread, Xiao Zhan's name was dragged into a boycott movement that targeted not only him, but also his fans and even brands associated with him. The 2/27 Memorial Day supertopic formed on Weibo, and according to overviews of the incident, brand pages linked to Xiao Zhan were flooded with negative comments, while cyber attacks and harassment widened across fan communities and bystanders alike. On March 1, 2020, Xiao Zhan Studio released a public apology as the storm intensified, but the apology did not simply calm everything down. In fact, later academic analysis notes that the apology itself dissatisfied many critics and did little to end the escalation. That is what makes this chapter so brutal. Xiao Zhan was trapped in the kind of modern public crisis where there is no clear action that can restore control once a platform-driven pylon has decided your face represents the problem. A 2025 article in the China Quarterly explicitly frames the 227 incident as a case of cancel culture with Chinese characteristics, which is a very precise way of describing what happened. Fandom conflict, censorship, moral outrage, and organized punishment all fused together into a campaign large enough to redefine how one of the biggest stars in the country was being seen. Xiao Zhan's fame had made him powerful. Now it made him absorbent. The larger his image had become, the easier it was for the entire internet to turn that image into a surface for collective rage. And maybe that is why this part of Xiao Zhan's story feels heavier than a normal scandal arc. He was not simply being judged for a private wrongdoing with a beginning, a verdict, and an ending. He became the symbolic center of a digital war bigger than himself, a conflict about fandom behavior, censorship, artistic freedom, queer fan culture, celebrity responsibility, and the terrifying instability of online adoration. When Xiao Zhan finally gave his first major interview after the incident in May 2020, reporting on the interview noted that he apologized, expressed confusion about how events had developed from February 27 onward, and said he did not believe idols should be treated as superiors who control their fans. That response matters because it shows the exact emotional trap he was inside. He could speak, but speaking could not fully solve the problem. He could apologize, but apologizing could not erase the fact that millions of people had already turned his name into shorthand for something much larger and uglier than any one performer can manage. This is the true emotional center of the Xiao Zhan script. 227 did not just damage his image, it exposed how fragile modern fame really is when fandom, anti-fandom, and platform culture all decide to use the same person as a battleground. Xiao Zhan did not simply suffer a backlash. He lived through a moment when being loved too intensely made him easier to destroy. And once a star survives that kind of storm, he is never just popular again. He becomes someone the world has already seen under public fire. What makes Xiao Zhan's ending powerful is that it does not feel like a clean redemption arc. It feels like endurance made visible. After the violence of 227, the most important thing was not that he returned overnight with some perfect public apology and instantly restored image. It was that he kept working, kept appearing, and slowly forced the conversation to become larger than the wound. Sunshine by My Side in 2023 mattered for exactly that reason. It reminded people that Xiao Zhan could still hold a contemporary drama without needing the chaos of fandom to carry every scene for him. The role of Shenyang let him appear softer, steadier, and more grounded than the version of him the public had seen during the ugliest years of backlash. That matters emotionally because it suggests something simple but hard-won. He did not disappear into the storm. He lasted past it, and once a star survives long enough for audiences to watch him in a calmer frame again, the old narrative begins to loosen its grip. But the real payoff comes from what happened after survival. Xiao Zhan did not return smaller. He returned with projects that kept proving his scale. In 2025, The Legend of Zhang Hai premiered on May 18, 2025, placing him at the center of a major revenge-driven period drama and confirming that he still had the weight to headline one of the year's biggest television releases. That same year, his album WM was available globally on Apple Music on March 14, 2025, showing that his presence was still extending across both acting and music rather than shrinking into one safer lane. This is what changes the emotional meaning of his story. If 2027 was the moment fame turned into a weapon, then the years after it became proof that the weapon had not been enough to erase him. Xiao Zhan was not only still visible, he was still bankable, still castable, still followed, and still powerful enough to make the industry keep building around him. So maybe that is the real ending of Xiao Zhan's story, at least for now. Not innocence restored and not scandal forgotten. Something more complicated than both. He entered the industry late, exploded through the Untamed, got caught in one of the most punishing internet backlashes attached to a Chinese star in recent memory, and still remained standing long enough for the work to keep growing around the damage. That is why his arc feels bigger than ordinary comeback language. He did not simply recover. He absorbed a level of public hostility that could have permanently reduced him to one incident, and then he kept moving until the incident became only one chapter instead of the whole book. The storm is still part of his mythology. It probably always will be. But now it sits beside something else. Proof of scale, proof of stamina, proof that the man at the center of that digital fire did not vanish when the internet wanted him to. Xiao Zhan did not defeat the storm by pretending it never happened. He defeated it by staying alive inside his own fame, long enough to become larger than the worst moment attached to his name.